Trent England Show is now in session. I just felt like I should do that. I'll tell you why I've got this up here in a few minutes. Thanks for watching the Trent England Show this Tuesday. Is education a public good? I was thinking about this yesterday after the show. I want to keep unpacking things that we've learned from the fake strike that shut down so many Oklahoma schools for the last 2 weeks. And one of the things I kept coming back to is this idea that education is a public good, and so therefore you have to give anybody who says they're a part of education anything they want. And that really, that was one of the attitudes I think was on display. A lot of wonderful people that we talked to up there at the state capitol over the last couple of weeks. But one of the attitudes that I think came through, even from some of those very wonderful, hardworking people who were up there, was this idea that, well, this is education. So if we want it, you have to give it to us because it's a good thing, right? And let's step back and question that premise a little bit. Can we do that? Is that okay? I know some people are just going to be offended. Some people are going to see the title of the show and they're just going to be totally offended that we're asking this question. But I think if you stick with me by the end of the show, we'll understand this is actually the right question for all of us to ask, whether we're taxpayers or teachers or anybody else, because it gets us back to basics when we talk about anything in education policy, whether it's consolidation or tax increases or teacher pay or anything else. So here's the question. Is education a public good? Well, let's ask the question first. What is a public good? So something is a public good if it has, I'll use the wonky term first, and then I'll break this down. Positive externalities. It has positive spillover effects. Things that, I might do something that's good for me, but it's also, it turns out good for you and just good for the people around me. It creates a public good. And, one of the challenges with that definition is that includes a lot of things. Think about it. Your lawn, my lawn, now that we have somebody taking care of it, I like it. It's in front of my house, but it also makes the neighborhood look better, right? It's just generally sort of pleasing to the eye. Everybody's property values go up a little bit if everybody around has a fairly well-kept front yard at least. And, it's a positive thing. It's a good thing, right? It actually creates some positive externalities, some positive spillover effects for my neighbors. It's a public good, right? What about parenting? Parenting is an obvious public good, right? Children need to be brought up right, and if you do that has huge positive spillover effects for society, right? This goes beyond the claims of education, right? Parenting is a tremendous public good exercise. I was thinking about this because my feet are a little sore because I've ran the last 2 days. And look, that, you might not see me out there. You're probably better off if you don't. But that's a public good because if I keep myself healthier, right, I'm less of a drain on the rest of society. I'm more productive. Healthy people are a public good. Right? And so if you start thinking about this, you realize, well, gee whiz, a lot of things. Basically, people living a good life, that's a public good. So one thing that should trigger in our minds right away is just because something is a public good doesn't mean it belongs to politicians or, the public. People say, these things belong to the public, but that always really means politicians, right? Just because something is a public good doesn't mean it belongs to politicians. Doesn't mean we should give politicians any part of it. I'm going to say it right now. If you're a politician out there, stay off my lawn. It might be a public good. It's not your business, right? Yeah, I'm that guy. So public good, what's a public good? Okay, but all those things that I mentioned can also be, this is not a phrase that's in common usage, but they can also be public bads, right? If I let my lawn go and it winds up looking like a disaster area and it's spreading weed seeds to all of my neighbors who are trying to take good care of their yards, right? My front yard, right now, it's a public good. Mostly that's because of Mrs. England, it has nothing to do with me. But my front yard is a public good, but it could also be a public bad. It could be a bad thing. What about parenting, right? Parenting done well is a tremendous public good. It's probably, again, there's probably nothing that is more of a public good than good parenting. But there's probably nothing that is more of a public bad, right? More of a drain on the public, at least in the future, than bad parenting. We're going to talk about a bill that has to do with parenting, actually. We'll get to some legislative items later in the program. Look, those things can be public goods. They can be public bads, right? I know that's not a phrase that people usually use, but I like it. What about exercise, right? Now, if I jog down the sidewalk, that's great. If I jog down the middle of the road, I might feel good, but if I cause somebody to get in an accident, that's not a good thing, right? I mean, there are potential negatives, downsides to all of these things. Just because something can be a public good doesn't mean that it's always a public good. Just because my front yard can be a public good, and even is a public good right now, doesn't mean that it's always going to be that way. Right? And I could say, well, I should get a subsidy, but my neighbor should have to subsidize the way I take care of my front yard because it's a public good. Well, that argument would go away if I stopped taking care of my front yard, if it stopped actually being a public good for the people around me, right? You see where I'm going with all of this? Okay. So look, what about education? Well, let's be a little more specific. Let's talk about schools, because when we talk about schools, I think it becomes pretty obvious. Schools are tools, right? Schools are tools. Like my lawnmower is a tool, like my running shoes are a tool, right? Like the wooden spoon is a tool if you're engaged in good parenting. I just offended somebody out there. But look, schools are tools. Are schools a public good? No. Schools can create a public good, a powerful public good, but schools are tools. Hammers are tools, screwdrivers are tools, schools are tools, right? And we should never let anybody run us over with this argument that just because something is involved in producing a public good, that thing is always a public good. I get people all the time quoting to me, usually from the founders, but I had to bring Plato here because I love this. Plato in his Apology says the unexamined life is not worth living. It's a great apology for education, for serious, thoughtful education in there. Right? George Washington, I get people pushing to me quotes of the founders. Well, you better be in favor of giving the school bureaucracy whatever they want because George Washington thought education was a good thing, right? If you actually crack this book, which is probably the best single volume of George Washington's letters and speeches and things, it's from Liberty Fund Books. George Washington cares about the substance of education. He writes to his nephew, he writes, you need to get educated because it will make you frugal. You'll understand economics. You'll become a better person, hopefully, if you get a good education, right? It wasn't just about, you need to be in school a certain number of hours a day and a certain number of days per year, and then, everything will work out. It's all about the substance. The same with James Madison, my favorite of the founding fathers. He writes in here about the substance of education and how we need education to produce good citizens. He writes about how we need to add to, he's kind of the first STEM guy, actually. He writes about how we need to add to reading, writing, and arithmetic, also the studies of geography and astronomy, and we need to try to get people interested in science and in the world around them. Why? Because it'll produce good citizens. And look, here is the point. Here's the important point. Education, if it just makes you smarter and you go off and make lots of money, that's a kind of a public good, right? I mean, being a self-sufficient individual who can take care of your family and donate to charity, that's a public good, right? But when it comes to a public good that directly impacts the way we govern ourselves, right? It has to go a little further than that. It's all about, you read George Washington, you read James Madison, you read Abraham Lincoln here. You can tell I've been in there a little bit. You read Abraham Lincoln, and it's all about producing good citizens because they understood the only argument that education is such a public good that it should be supported by tax dollars is that it produces good citizens. And if it doesn't produce good citizens, who cares? Why should we support it with tax dollars at all? And look, this isn't an argument for or against any particular legislative proposal up the street at 23rd and Lincoln, but it is an argument about how we should think about and talk about and consider and hold education accountable to this standard, right? If our schools aren't educating people, they're not even engaged in a public good. If they can't teach kids to read, then it may or may not be their fault. I mean, look, I will posit maybe every illiterate student who has graduated from an Oklahoma high school, maybe in no case, in no instance, is it the fault of those schools or any of those teachers or principals or anybody involved. But they still failed to produce a public good. They still deserve no money from the public, no support from the public. If they can't do it, whether it's the material or the process or anything else, right? If the tool doesn't work, time to find a new tool, right? And they're only producing a public good that at least meets the argument of people like this, Washington, Lincoln, Madison, right? If they're actually producing good citizens, and if they're not producing good citizens, then why are they asking for public support at all? Which isn't an argument that we shouldn't give them the public support. It is an argument that we should actually pay attention to the substance of what goes on in our schools, and we shouldn't take it for granted. And the folks out there, I mean, this has become a standard practice of mine when I argue with people who say, well, we've got to do this and we've got to do that because it's about education. I ask them, well, what if it was California? What if we were living in California? Would you make the same argument where California public schools are dedicated to, in state law, brainwashing people with a version of ultra far left progressivism, basically anti-family, anti-Christian? Would you feel the same way? And usually with most some Oklahomans out there, there are some who say, absolutely, that's why we support this system. That's where we're going with this system. But you get a lot of other Oklahomans who say, well, probably not, or I'm not sure, or what, and you force them at least to confront the fact that what matters is the substance. Okay, is education a public good? It can be, sometimes. But schools are tools, and we should hold them accountable for actually producing the results that actually are a public good. Okay, there we go. Send me your feedback. Send me your angry messages on Facebook if you want to. I actually love that. And it's the end. It is not the means that matters. Okay, a couple of legislative items here before we wrap up the show. Criminal justice bills are set to be up in the Oklahoma legislature probably starting today and through the rest of this week. Great to see that the legislature has put those things on the calendars, moved those things to the forefront. A lot of those bills really need to pass. And again, the same thing goes with the criminal justice system, right? If all we do is just warehouse people, and then when they get out, they're worse criminals than they were before, they're still addicted to drugs, or they still have all the problems that they went in with, right? Again, the process should be subjugated to the ends, right? The means of whatever we do in criminal justice, right? It need always to be judged based on the ends. So if we're throwing people in prison and that's not working, right? If that's not creating a safer society and actually creating people who become productive members of society, we need to question how we're doing things, question the process, not just shovel more money at it. This is true of every area of government, from the military to public schools and everything else. Okay. Utah has a great bill. This was from last month, but I wanted to put this in front of you because I thought this was such a great development. I hope this comes here to Oklahoma. I hope this spreads across the country. You may have seen that in some states, they've been interpreting child neglect laws to the point where parents can't leave their children alone. Even kids who are 12, 13, 14 years old, not allowed to ride bikes down the street, not allowed to walk down a sidewalk, not allowed to play in a park. I know some people out there are paralyzed by fear. They think that the world we live in today is, just full of creepy people. When you actually look at the statistics, that's not true. The world's a little safer today than it used to be in the 60s, 70s. But what Utah did is they passed a law clarifying their child neglect laws to say that nobody can be investigated or arrested or anything else for allowing a 12-year-old child to bicycle down the street, or for allowing a kid to walk to the bus stop. It's called there. I think you can see it in the headline, called free-range parenting. I think that's that phrase is designed to kind of perk people's ears up a little bit, maybe stir the pot somewhat. But I think it's a great development in Utah, and I think that parents should stop being so paranoid about our children. As they get older, they got to become adults, right? It's back to this whole thing of creating future adults, future free people. Okay, what else do we have here? One more story. Scammers in politics. This used to be a theme of the Trent England Show when we were on the radio, and I just wanted to bring this back because I think it's so important. This story, you may have seen it, the largest Facebook page about Black Lives Matter was actually a scam. Was actually people who set this page up, and they were running it as a scam. They were raising money off of it. They raised about $100,000, or I think a little more than that, off of this page as just a straight up scam. And I put this in front of people because this happens on the left, it happens on the right, it happens any political cause that has a lot of emotion behind it, any political cause that gets people excited, you'll find scammers. Basically, any draft somebody candidate page is probably a scam. Not all the time, but probably a scam. Things like this, right? We need to be not cynical, but skeptical, especially before we give our money to folks. And again, this was on the left, happens all the time on the right. That's why I bring it up on the program. I hate it when people get scammed by people who are trying to take advantage of well-meaning Americans, whatever our political position. Okay, wrapping up the show, two great guests coming up. Jamie Lund, senior policy analyst from the Freedom Foundation, is going to be with me to talk about what else? Public education and public sector unions. We're going to talk to Jamie Lund from the Freedom Foundation. He's going to be here in Oklahoma on Thursday on the program. And then next week, I mentioned this on the show the other day, next week we are going to have a man who's really leading an effort to create a unique kind of charter schools, including one here in Oklahoma City. Phil Gover is going to be with me next Wednesday on the show. You won't want to miss this coming Thursday and next Wednesday. I'm Trent England. Thanks so much for watching. Remember, you can subscribe on, where are we? YouTube. Where are we not? YouTube, iTunes, SoundCloud. The whole archive is at ocpathink.org. And as always, interact on Facebook. Share your thoughts, share your questions, guests we should have on upcoming programs. Thanks so much for watching The Trent England Show.